Hi, everyone. It's July 5th, 2022, and welcome to the latest Joe Rosenthal chapter speaker series. 79 years ago, on July 17th, 1944, an explosion at Port Chicago, California, a U.S. Navy munitions base, killed 320 military and civilian personnel and injured 390 more. It's considered the largest domestic loss of life during World War II. Like the entire Navy and the entire US Armed Forces during World War II, Port Chicago was strictly segregated, and many of the casualties were Black sailors. The day after the explosion, 200 Black sailors refused to return to work on the docks unless unsafe and unfair conditions were addressed. 50 sailors were tried and convicted of mutiny and imprisoned by a military tribunal. It's known as the Port Chicago disaster, and it certainly was. Today's speaker, retired attorney and law instructor Oak Dowling, calls Port Chicago a hallmark legal case on the issue of racial segregation. He's an expert on the disaster and its aftermath, and will talk about the causes of the disaster and its legal trajectory. Oak says he's been consumed by history from a young age, and he told me earlier today that his grandfather served on the Union side during the Civil War, and he's had family in the military, US military since then. A Chicago native, he graduated from the University of Wisconsin-Madison Law School and practiced law for 43 years before retiring. He's lived in Marin County, California for over 50 years. And for over 25 years, he was part-time instructor of law at the College of Marin. For the past 12 years, he's been an instructor in the OLLI program, I believe it's pronounced, at Dominican University of California on the subject of courtroom drama in the movies and theater. Oak is an active and longtime member of several Marin County service organizations, including 46 years with the Rotary Club of San Rafael, where he served as director and as speaker's chairman. Oak's been married to 60 years to his college sweetheart, Mary. They have 2 children and 3 grandchildren. And without further ado, here is Oak Dowling.
Thank you so much, Tom. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'd like to start out by saying, you know who George Burns is. He said, the secret of a good sermon is to have a good beginning and a good ending, then having the two as close together as possible. So if I'm going to give a sermon today, I want to make it quick. And so let's go to the share screen. And I'm going to get myself on here. Here we go. Okay, I'm gonna get into this. Hopefully, you know, that has given me a thing called whiteboard, which I don't want. So let's see what share screen does. Oh, there it is. Okay, that's a relief. You never know this technology. Okay, so let me go first to the slides and we'll play from the start. Now, this is a little rendition, short rendition of getting you in the mood. This is an animation of course, the sea. And this is a sailor. And this is underwater, which many were. And this is the drowning of some, and this is the explosion. And indeed, many wound up in the sky. So what is this? Port Chicago, I think it's Ray from Illinois, is not in Chicago. Port Chicago is in California in the East Bay near Concord. it is still an active munitions base. And you can go out there, but you have to have clearance, and you don't go near the munitions base. It's loading all the time ammunition for our services, as well as selling ammunition to, I'm sure, South Korea, Japan, and I'm sure the North Koreans know exactly where it is. So that they want to start a war, they're going to be after that ammunition base. It did indeed start the movement on civil rights. Before the Montgomery bus boycotts, the freedom rides, the voter registration drives in the South, there was Port Chicago. And Port Chicago was the absolute impetus for desegregation of the Navy and then desegregation of all the armed forces. And because of that, the movement then went on into the 60s, where Johnson had the Civil Rights Act, and we had a lot of change. So this is hugely significant. This is my syllabus. Here you have some pictures, and I did considerable research on photography. Because I only have 40 minutes, I cut out about 75 slides. So you got the creme of the creme. But here's what I've got to talk about: the location, explosion, aftermath, the alleged mutiny, and trial for mutiny. And remember what a mutiny is. I gave a talk at the Civil Rights Centennial on Treasure Island Museum in February of 2019. About 300 people were there. It was an amazing experience talking about it. If you're interested, they have a nice exhibit there, but it's not the main one. The National Park Service has taken over this story, and my friends, it is fabulous out there what they're doing. I was there when there was a sign over from the Navy to the National Park Service of something like 200 acres. On the other side, I think, of Highway 4, that's going to be a major, major project for the National Park Service. Okay, somebody mentioned the book. Here's the book. It was by Robert L. Allen, who is a former professor at UC Berkeley, and it is the Bible on Port Chicago. I commend it to you as a really fine, fine book. It really covers the whole story. Here is an aerial view of Port Chicago as of 1944, and you'll see this spit that comes out from the land, and there are rails coming in here. If you've been to Port Chicago, and I suggest you go out there, it's kind of barren. These are revetments. That is, they're walls around rail cars that go in there that protect the rail cars from explosion. You know, they were always worried about explosions. But then this is the pier. And you notice that ships docked on both sides of the pier. It's like a sandwich. You know, you have a sandwich, you have a piece of bread here and a piece of bread there, and you got the meat in between. Well, the pier was the meat. They don't do that anymore, for the very reason of what happened at Port Chicago, because one exploded and exploded the other ships. Now, here is where Port Chicago is. It's Martinez is here, and that is where the fuel loading was. The fueling of the fuel for the ships was here, and then it had to be, the fuel oil had to be sluiced. That is, water put into it and diluted. But yet one of the ships came up, actually both of them, that were involved with pure fuel in it. Here is San Rafael up here, Mill Valley. I'm going to show you where the area of the blast was, but you got an idea where we are. Construction started in 1942. Sailors worked around the clock. There's the spit. There are rail lines going in there like crazy. It's just this wild stuff. And then up here is where the current, what they call it, Marine Terminal, military is where they're selling stuff to everybody. Okay. I did some research on this. There are no pictures left, obviously, of the two vessels, the Quinault and the Bryan. But the Quinault was Victory class, which was for cargo, and Brian was Liberty class, which was supposedly for troops, but sometimes used for cargo. I think the Jeremiah O'Brien is one of the few left, and it's in San Francisco Bay, and it was for troops. Take a look at that. Okay, this is a very key slide. Here's the sandwich I just talked about. The Quinault Victory was out on the side toward the bay, Sassoon Bay. This is on Sassoon Bay. The Bryant was on the inside toward the land. The Quinault had just come up the day before, July 17th, actually the day of, early in the morning. The Bryant had been there about 3 days. It was partially loaded, but just as important, there were 16 rail cars loaded with ammunition on this dock right here. Now, Torpaz was this anti-submarine munition, which was on this dock. There was many other bombs. I'm going to talk about the bombs that were there, but it was partially loaded and being loaded by all black Navy. And I'm going to talk about the conditions were rotten, terrible conditions that were given to these Navy, the black Navy, to load. They were forced to load fast. It was almost akin to something in a southern plantation, where if they didn't load fast enough, they were put in the brig. So this is what I'm talking about. If I were to conclude this whole lecture right now, I would have covered it by saying no training. The commander of the operation, Kenny, had no training in handling of ammunition. There was no training given to these black sailors to load these vessels. No training. I cannot emphasize that enough. There's no training. How in the hell can you run an operation of all these explosives with no training? And these rail cars would come in with all kinds of ammunition stuck in there, and they would have to pull it out. And a lot of it was by hand, by winches that were not working. I'm going to talk about winches. And they were carried over by very, very crude means into the vessels. The officers in charge of these blacks that were loading the vessels were all white. And they set up a gambling program. You heard me right, a gambling program with whoever got to get his group to load most ammunition first won the bet and got the money. They were racing each other, pushing each other, and they were going 24/7. What do you think about that? Ammunition. And of course, there was segregation. And look at the segregation. In those years, 1944, it was highly segregated in the military. Black sailors at Port Chicago, they were the chain gang, the mule team, the slave outfit, and so forth. They were all over, segregated. They were supposedly cooks. Now, I want to tell you about the training of the blacks that were doing the loading at Port Chicago. They came from my area, which is Chicago, and that's Great Lakes Naval Training Center. They came out of Great Lakes, and these guys were the lowest as far as testing was concerned. They would test them for intelligence and skills and all this stuff, and they were the lowest. They were promised that they would be trained into things like electrician and various other things. Instead, they were made out to be a slave outfit. So right away, there was disappointment. You got an accident waiting to happen. That's for damn sure. So the African-American sailors had received no training. They were 24/7, and the bombs were wedged snugly and tightly into the boxcars. Now, here's a picture of the vessel. Here is the crude arrangements to load these vessels. I'm going to show you more details on this. Now, I'm going to stop here. You can't just look at this lecture and listen to me. You have to be active. Look at that picture and tell me what's wrong. And do we have chat going?
Yes, we do.
Okay, I'm going to say, put your comments in chat. I can't see chat, but maybe you can, Tom.
I'll be happy to read them.
Yeah, read them to me. Tell me what's wrong in that picture.
Anybody have any observations?
Okay, you got to work. All right, look. This box says high explosives dangerous. What is he doing on top of that box? He's banging away a bombshell. And I'm not sure what this is, but it looks like it's some sort of way of changing the shell housing and also the fuse. Also, I want to tell you, this is not a well-organized way of handling ammunition. I saw in the news last night for the Ukraine war that they're going 24/7 in the ammunition factories in the United States for the Ukraine. And boy, are they mechanized. The sailors that were here, the black sailors, were dropping bombs off of the table onto the floor. Here is the white officer and the blacks loading. This looks like it's unloading a rail car. No, that's loading the ship because the water is here. Okay. This is a way of unloading. And as far as the Bryan was concerned, that's the one on the inward side next to the land. That day on the 17th, there were 1,000-pound bombs into number 3 hold, and incendiary bombs were being loaded as well. They were 650 pounds each and were live. Their fuses were installed. Do you hear me right? They were live bombs that were being put on there. How in the hell could they do that? The other thing is Torpaz charges that were sensitive, more sensitive than TNT to external shock, and they were anti-submarine. Sitting on the pier, resting on 3 parallel rail spurs, were 16 rail cars loaded with ammunition. 430 short tons of explosive, and all the munitions on the and in the ship contained the equivalent of approximately 2,000 short tons of TNT. All right, this to me is very important. First of all, here's a picture of a train. This is the 24/7, and this is loading. But on July 17th, the day of the explosion, a bleeder valve on winch number 4 required immediate repair. Albert Carr, a civil service plumber from Pittsburgh, California, was called to replace it. It was his first day on the job. He found it. He replaced it. He noticed the winches were in terrible shape. They would wear out, and the gears would wear out. So what they would do to stop them would be throw it in reverse. It's like saying that your car is worn out, and the way you can stop your car is put it in reverse. While he was there, he saw a man accidentally drop a naval artillery shell 2 feet onto the wooden pier, and it didn't explode. Now, I want to talk to you about the unions and the stevedores in Oakland. They heard about this disastrous situation, and these people in the union offered to come over and train the black stevedores, the black sailors. That was rejected. They said they didn't need that. They were good enough as they were, and as far as they were concerned, there might be some sabotage. This is ridiculous. The unions were very, very good at this. The speed of loading these vessels that was accomplished by the black sailors was almost equal to what stevedores could do in Oakland. Now, I'm looking at the chat. It says there's no secure area for these unloaded bombs. There's no protective clothing. What was the temperature control? Great comments. Great comments. All right, so let's look. We got an explosion at about 10 o'clock in the evening of July 17th. Next year, it's going to be 80 years. It's now 79 years. There is a picture roughly of the scene, but we'll get into more detail on that. I want to explain something. If you want to see a film on Port Chicago, you can go on YouTube. It's called Mutiny. The film was made by NBC. It was shown once and then disappeared. Where did it come out? Where did it come up again? In Germany. The Germans are fascinated with Port Chicago. So if you're going to watch it on YouTube, it's going to be all in German. And I used some scenes in my Port Chicago talk at Treasure Island. And in that, we did get some English translation. This is a screenshot from the film showing the explosion of the vessel. Now, of course, we don't have pictures of the explosion really, but there is a simulated explosion. And it was the explosion of the Bryant, the inward vessel, that blew up first. It disintegrated. It eviscerated. It didn't exist anymore. They couldn't find it. There was an airplane flying over the area when the explosion occurred. It was an Army airplane. The debris was 3 miles high, which was roughly 12,000 feet. What the pilot saw was pieces of metal the size of a garage, a plume like the atomic bomb. 10:18, 2 explosions. The Quinault and Bryan partially loaded exploded both by the pier. 1,000 within 1,000 yards was killed. 320 died. 202 African American and nearly 400 more injured. Most of those that died were eviscerated. That means there's nothing left. There's no bodies. Here is a very interesting picture. This is from an old book. This shows you the area of the blast. Here's Port Chicago. Here is where most of the damage was to civilian facilities, homes, buildings, and to people. I have a friend who's now just turned 90. She was living in the East Bay at the time when this thing blew up, and she thought it was an earthquake. A lot of people thought the Japanese were attacking. This is San Rafael where I am, but more importantly, here is San Francisco, and that blast blew out windows in hotels in San Francisco. There was a lot of civilian damage, significantly. Okay, there you are. I did a comparison. The blast had a force of 5 kilotons, which is 11,023,000 pounds of TNT. Hiroshima was 15 kilotons, 33,069,000 pounds. I think 130,000 people were killed in Hiroshima. It was a third of Hiroshima. Amazing. The Quinault was lifted out of the water. The Bryan was nowhere to be found. It was 3.4 on the Richter scale. And who is, okay, tell me who that is and put that on the chat. You got to have to work here, guys. This is not a lecture. This is a class. That is J. Robert Oppenheimer, the inventor of the atomic bomb. Why do I have him here? He was there. He was in Berkeley when the explosion occurred. He was at UC Berkeley, and the next day he came down to the site to inspect it to see if it was a nuclear blast. There's an apocryphal theory that this was a nuclear blast, that there was an airplane that was shuttling nuclear weapons from one part of the bay to the other and accidentally dropped something. That is wrong, but it's still out there. Sailors were then brought in, black and white, to do something about taking care of the wounded and also the dead. And you can see this, what happened, an arm and a head. a head and a helmet, and that's all, things floating, and it was just terrible shock. It was unbelievable. Here is a similar explosion, and I did some research on similar explosions, but I don't have the time to go through all of it. In fact, I'm running out of time already. And this is a explosion of a vessel in New Guinea where 295 sailors were obliterated, 29 other vessels, 22 other vessels affected. Here's, I got a nice note from Tom about Merchant Marine were also killed, 69 supposedly. Here's something from the newspaper, and they died. Okay, here's the aftermath. This is what it looked like. Now, this is a great picture. This is the explosion site taken from an airplane. Look at the rails coming in here, and here's the blast area, and this is a blow up of the blast area right there. This is where the ships were. And if you go out there, this is the pier that's left today. Nothing. Okay, and you got to move along. There's the Quinault, which was on the far side, on the bay side, and did blow up, but there was a piece of it. The Brian was completely eviscerated. This is the railway station. Virtually every building was blown up. This is the damage to the actual pier. This is the barracks. This is a comment. There's a wonderful, wonderful amount of commentary and research done from the sailors. And they said, Ollie Green, if we didn't work fast at the time, they wanted to put us in the brig. They came down on the docks and they wanted us to slow up. That is if an officer saying, and then when it left, they made you speed up because they're gambling. Here's the carpenter shop. Complete mess. This is in the revetment. If you go out there, they have these rail cars and revetments, which was protected. Even in the revetments, there was damage to the cars extensively. This is the munitions explosion tube. This is another site of the pier in the Quinault. Now look at this. A sailor in his car was flung off the highway by the explosion. This is the sailor, and that's his car, and the car was blown off the highway. All right, this is the Chow Hall. A lot of this is still out there. They're trying to preserve it. This is another view of the explosive area. In the little town of Port Chicago, which is kind of a dump, they had a movie theater. It was blown up. The wall was just destroyed. Most of the town of Port Chicago was destroyed. This is an interesting thing of a lady who was an office worker involving the accounting for the munitions. And she said the door was blown across the room and ended up on the other side. All the nails in the ceiling came off. They thought it was the Japanese. She said that it didn't take long before they found out what it was. And she went back to work to clean up the mess. This is DeWitt Jameson. He said that there was no formal training, but we were not actually ignorant of the fact that it was dangerous. He said this is a very educational experience, etc. All right, now this is a scene from the film, and there was a claim of alleged mutiny. Okay, this is a picture which could purport to be the sailors reporting in for further work at Port Chicago, but what they did is they moved the dock over to Mare Island while they were repairing Port Chicago. And this is a picture which is unidentified, but I think of the sailors going back to work. There was an investigation which was made, and the investigation which was made by the Navy, all white senior officers and so forth, came to this conclusion. In the opinion of the witnesses, is that the colored enlisted personnel are neither temperamentally or intellectually capable of handling high explosives. It is an admitted fact supported by the testimony of the witnesses. There was rough and careless handling of the explosives being loaded. So they put the blame on the blacks, not on the whites. There wasn't a single white officer blamed, no whites at all blacks. So they took the sailors that had been involved in this, that survived, and they took them over to Vallejo, and they put them in a barracks, and they were in shock. The other whites who were involved were given 30 days leave. The black sailors got nothing. They were very nervous. They were very concerned about returning to work. So they were asked to go back to the pier to Mare Island and go back to work. And this is the famous left face. They were supposed to go left face to go to the barge to take them over to Mare Island and go to work, and they refused to do a left face. And that just freaked out the whites. And they said this was a mutiny, and they were taken, 250 of them, and imprisoned in a barge. They were placed in a barge, held for 3 days. While in the barge, Joe Small was the leader, and he said, "We've got the officers by the balls. They can do nothing to us if we don't do anything to them. If we stick together, they can't do anything. How can they call it a mutiny?" The sailors pay dearly for this faulty assumption. And my friends, what is a mutiny? That's when you take over the ship, right? Okay, so these 250 were lined up, and Admiral Carleton Wright came up and said, "I want to remind you that mutinous conduct in the time of war carries a death sentence, and the hazards of facing a firing squad are far greater than the hazards of handling ammunition." And they were, of course, threatened with death. This is a picture from the film of that announcement, and 200 of the sailors were terribly frightened, and they had been through a lot, and they didn't want to get killed. So they said, okay, we'll go back to work. 50 of them, as it was, there were 6 added, 50 of them said, no, we're not going back to work. The 200 were given summary court-martials anyway, and dishonorably discharged later, but they had to go to work after they served something like 30 days. The other 50 were charged with mutiny. Here is really an excellent picture. There's a lot of pictures copied from this, but this is a very clear, sharp picture, friends, of the sailors that were charged and tried in the mutiny trial. This is the largest mutiny trial in the history of the Navy. 50 of them charged all at once. You notice all the lawyers and judge that's involved, there's many other judges, are white, no blacks. This is on the newspapers that came up. And who were the lawyers? The first one was James Frank Coakley, who was the Alameda prosecutor. And later in the case, Thurgood Marshall came, who became a justice on the U.S. Supreme Court. Initially, there was a lawyer from Texas whose name is Veltman, who actually did a very good job. But then the pressure because of the black segregation came up. And this is what Veltman said, and I think this is great. "There's no such charge under naval jurisdiction as conspiracy to attempt a mutiny. Either you do it or you don't." And I don't think there was any more guilty of mutiny than I was. This was, when you have a mutiny, you take over the ship. This was insubordination. Coakley said, "Collective insubordination. I am going to give you another chance. If you don't come clean this time, I'm going to see that you are going to be shot." They were told they were going to be shot. Thurgood Marshall came in about midway in the case. "There's no sufficient evidence of mutiny or conspiracy. I do not take up cases in lumps. I'm convinced the men were innocent." The trial begins. All 50 testified. The trial began on September 14, and all of the officers trying and deciding the case were white. There were no blacks at all. And you know what the judges did? They fell asleep. There were a lot of sleeping judges. They didn't give a shit. And here you have, let me go back one second. Okay, yeah. Here you have an interesting comment. You know who Eddie Slovic is? He's the only soldier, only military person who was executed because of military conduct. And that is, he refused to fight. And this was in Europe. And much has been made of that. The presentation of the evidence, the issue was that these sailors were in fright. They said, many of them, that they never heard a direct order from the white officers. And Veltman said they were no more guilty of mutiny than they were flying to the moon. And all 50 testified. So Thurgood Marshall got into the picture. He was brought in by the NAACP, and he said, this is the whole Navy on trial. You know, there were worse explosions that occurred during World War II than this. But as far as a principle, this is the biggest. And by the way, what was happening in 1944, you Marine historians, Saipan, Iwo Jima had just occurred or was occurring, and many more military were being killed than were killed at Port Chicago. That's not the point. Yes, it is the point about death, of course. But the point is that this was as a result of segregation and mistreatment and failure of training. And there you are. I want to know why the Navy disregarded an offer by these same unions to send experienced men to train Navy personnel. Why not? Okay, they were sentenced. After 6 weeks of hearing the deliberations, they spent the lunch hour deciding on a verdict. They didn't spend any, they knew it already. It's all hell with them. And of course, in the court-martial, the judges were also the jury, so they found them all 50 guilty and sentenced them to 5 to 15 years. Marshall said they deliberated about a minute and a half for each defendant. There's another statement. Here's some comments with some pictures. This is the first time in a naval court history in which 50 men have been tried at one time, and I would think probably the last. Is there one or more Negro Navy officers sitting on the panel? Everybody knows there's not. There wasn't a single one. And this is an interesting picture of a court-martial in 1917 involving an incident in Houston, Texas, all black. Marshall brought an appeal. It was unsuccessful. This went all the way up to Roosevelt. Roosevelt had, of course, died in 1945, and Truman was in. This was something that was brought up to the president. And in January of 46, Truman desegregated the Navy. Frederick Douglass was an abolitionist in the 1800s, and he knew very well the sacrifice of black soldiers in the Civil War. And there was a common thread, not only at Port Chicago, Tuskegee, Wax, Fort Devens, Rousseau, and as the Chicago Defender, a black newspaper, said, the Negro will give life for his country, but he will not be a slave. Joe Small, he was the leader. He said, I didn't do anything about a mutiny. And this one is for you guys. Jack Crittenden said, they told me I had a choice between the Marine Corps and the Navy. The man said, hey, we'll take a skinny guy like you and fatten you up and make you a fine Marine. And remember, the Marines are the first to land and they'll make history right away. And I said, first to land? He said, yeah. So I said, where's the Navy? And that's how I came by the Navy. He said the trial was about the people and it was fixed. Freddie Meeks was another one. And I have probably 15 testimonials. I only have picked out 3 or 4. He says the same. Percy Robinson was in that picture of loading one of the vessels. All right, I'm doing pretty well, Tom. I'm still hanging in there, and I want to give you a quick epilogue of what has happened in terms of segregation and the blacks in World War II. Here is a kitchen set up in Attu, Aleutian Islands. I had a cousin who was in the Seabees up there. men enjoying a hot meal. Here's World War I soldiers, black soldiers coming back. The 369th Infantry from France covered themselves with glory. This was a private in Europe who is displaying a bullet that went into from a Nazi plane that went into his windshield. This is the Tuskegee Airmen. Very famous, but you know, they couldn't use the officers club because it was all white, and they protested, and they made a great statement on that. Here's another flyer for a pilot in Tuskegee, and these African American mess attendants volunteered as additional duty as gunners in 1942. WACs were involved. They were college graduates, well skilled in everything. Instead, they were given duty in the kitchen. They were scrubbing floors. They were not using their abilities. Fort Devens was a protest against racial discrimination, and Dory Miller was the hero of one of the heroes of Pearl Harbor. He was a mess clerk, and he came up during the fight with the Japanese, and he manned the guns. This one is interesting. The hypocrisy of segregation. This was the Battle of the Bulge. I've taken a military tour of Bastogne in the Ardennes, and this was online in German. The Germans are fascinated, even today, by American segregation. They can't understand it, but neither can we. That these were black soldiers that were in the Ardennes at the Battle of the Bulge. And I remember as a kid, I'm 83, 1955, I worked construction. And this guy was ran a dozer. And he was in the Battle of the Bulge, and he told me some of the story, not much about the black soldiers and how they were decimated. And here's Truman. He wipes out segregation in the armed forces completely. I think that was 48. And here, you guys, this is for the Marines. In 1944, then Sergeant Edgar Huff inspects recruits at Montfort Point Camp. The Marine Corps intended to discharge African Americans after World War II, but as time progressed and these black leathernecks proved themselves just as capable as white Marines, the Corps changed its plans. And this is a picture, a photograph that I think I got online. I took some of my own, and this is of Port Chicago today. And this is the resolution, which has failed. How it's failed, I don't know, but it's to exonerate all those that were convicted of the Port Chicago mutiny. One of them was pardoned. I think it was Percy Robinson was pardoned. And if you get a pardon, that means that you did it, but they're going to excuse it. They refused pardons, and the families did, and they want a resolution exonerating. It gets through the Democratic side of the Congress, but the Republicans refuse to consider it. Friends of Port Chicago is a very active organization, which is really spearheading much of this history. And Port Chicago is now a national park, and it's a huge one. This is going to be an amazing place out there. They're developing it. The pandemic slowed it down, and now it's going full tilt. And this is a plaque in Vallejo to the 50 who stood up in the trial and said no. And this is some of the scenes from the Port Chicago site. And this is a rendering of some of the work that they're going to have on the, I guess it's the south side of Highway 4, for all that land that the Navy gave to the National Park Service, a terrific piece of work. And this is what is going on now at Port Chicago. This is the current military ocean terminal Concord right here. See this? This is the monument, but this is active. And this is sending, God knows what is coming in. Now there must be 150 rail lines going in there. It reminds me of downtown Chicago. You got all kinds of rail lines, And they have had explosions of some of those munition cars in Sacramento. They'll stop in Sacramento and then they bring them on in. So it's still dangerous as hell, but they will load one vessel at a time as opposed to two going, obviously. And next week, a week from Saturday, July 15th, is going to be the commemoration and the recognition of those that died and those that stood up for their rights. And that will be at Port Chicago. You need to get clearance to go in there. And here's the last. This is a rendering of the site. And actually, Tom, I'm surprised I did quite well on that. And there's a question here, I think, on the chat. Okay, it said, did the men serve their full terms? No, they did not. As soon as the war ended and Truman desegregated, they were let out. And this is interesting. They were let out, but they were not let out of the Navy. They were required to do commissary work and work in the kitchens on vessels for another year or two to work out their requirements. And then they were dishonorably discharged from the military service, thus rendering them incapable of receiving benefits, and furthermore, making it extremely hard to get a job because they were like prisoners. They were prisoners that were persons that have been in prison and can't work. All right, I'm done. I did it.
Well, thank you, Oak. That was awesome. And I have pages and pages of notes here, and I couldn't possibly write down everything I wanted to. But thanks for answering Steve's question in the chat. I was going to ask you about the final chapter for the men involved, and I think you just answered that.
Yep.
So we'll open it up to questions. If there aren't too many of us, if you can shout out or just speak up with your question, if we could do that one at a time, or if you'd like to, Gary has his hand up already. So go ahead, Gary.
Hi, Oak. Thank you so much for that marvelous lecture today. I really appreciate it. Just as a point, I interviewed a black Camp Stewart Army veteran, and he was at Utah Beach and also drove for the Red Ball Express. And in his book, he mentioned as these fellows they were not only fighting the enemy, but they were fighting Jim Crow at the same time.
Boy, that's exactly right. That's a brilliant statement. They had a double enemy, and it was just so tragic that they were subjected to a farcical gambling mechanism where these guys were being pushed because the white officers wanted to win the bet.
And same thing with the Red Ball Express, because the African-American drivers of those trucks had to drive at night many times, and their headlights had cat's eyes and not the full illumination. Oh. And sometimes the white drivers would play cat and mouse with them. It was a very similar story.
I've given this lecture a number of times, and when I gave it at Treasure Island, several gentlemen came up to me that were retired naval officers, and they said they were just aghast. They said that the white officers and commanders should have been court-martialed for that kind of treatment at that time. And of course, today, the mechanism for loading is completely different.
Oak, it was certainly a disaster waiting to happen. But was there anything special about the conditions on July 17th that had happened that day?
Yes, my theory, and this is a question of theory, is the winches. The winches were not operating right, and it had been for about a week. And they had civilian plumbers coming in there trying to get the winches to work. And what happens is when the winches weren't working, the bombshells would fall off and go down maybe 2, 5, 6 feet. Well, on the night this occurred, and this is actually in the film as well, the winch, one of the principal winches, was not working. The gears were stripped. So as I said, to stop it, they would put it in reverse. You don't stop your car by putting it in reverse. And they were dropping shells all over the place.
Wow.
That's my theory.
Wow.
I mean, the maintenance was non-existent. The situation, of course, was very dire because American military needed that equipment in the Pacific War. It was desperate. This was one of the main bases for supplying them. We have a hand up.
Go ahead, Ed.
Yeah, first of all, Oak, I'd like to thank you for the great presentation. I live about 4 miles away from Port Chicago. Been here 20 years and I haven't been over there yet. Although I did know Gloria Maggabee very well. She was a great lady. But now you got my curiosity up, and I'm going to start looking at that a little closer. We have many residents of I live in Bay Point, which is an unincorporated community, same zip code as Pittsburgh. And I'm going to, pay more attention to it from here out. I go down, going to that memorial. You said you have to know somebody to get in. You have to get cleared to go in, or how does that work?
First of all, Ed, when they were looking for a name for Port Chicago, they were considering Bay Point.
Is that right?
It's going to be called Bay Point.
Uh-huh.
and they said, no, we'll go ahead and do this. And I'm not sure why they picked Chicago, but it certainly was there. Yes, what you have to do is get clearance, which is very easy. You can do it online, and you give them your driver's license number, and you go in and you park, and then they have buses that take you in. It's very, very important to understand the history before you go in, because there isn't very much there.
Yeah.
It's just kind of blank, and there's these piers that are blown out, and there's a few statues and stuff like that. And the ceremonies, of course, once a year are very nice. And the speeches are very good, and you get an idea of what's behind it all. Some of the congressmen come out. There's a lot of military that come out. They have a ceremony on that. And I found it fascinating to look off to the right, and as you're facing the bay, and see the port terminal that's operating, because they have these huge cranes. I mean, they're up 10 stories, it looks like, and they're putting that stuff in there all the time. And this is the Pacific side, but I'm wondering how they're shipping this stuff out to Ukraine. This is an interesting story, because, ammunition cannot be flown over there efficiently, put it that way. So it's worth the trip. The revetments are there. That's fun to see. They drive you through what's left of Port Chicago, which is nothing. A couple of sidewalks, that's it. But I think the thing that's going to be fantastic is the National Park Service on the other side of Highway 4 is got these 300 acres, and it's gorgeous country out there. My gosh, they ride horses and hike and everything, and they've got these ammunition storage tanks out there that are all over, and they're going to connect those. And that's where
I'm familiar with those, as a matter, but it seems to me that all the discussion that's been going on over the 20 years I've been here is, what real estate developer from Concord is going to develop what parts of that. But I'm familiar with that. When I was in Vietnam, I actually saw ASP-1 near Da Nang go up in smoke. That was explosion took about 3 days to take place, and probably just almost as noisy as this one was. But I didn't know that they'd made a decision to make it a national park. I still thought it was still up to the realtors to decide who was going to get which plots.
Well, thank God. In 1994, they did it, but the acquisition from the Navy is terrific.
Yeah. I wanted to see them move Cal State East Bay campus there. And
well, wouldn't that be something?
So they could, be a great place for football. So I graduated from what was Cal State Hayward in those days.
Yeah.
And but that would be a great place that could have the whole campus all in one place and so forth.
It's a beautiful site. Beautiful site.
Yeah, it is. It really is.
I can tell you, Ed, and others. I urge you to visit the the site at Port Chicago. The annual event is coming up, and I'm sure it's pretty easy to find online to reserve in advance, present your ID, etc. It is, as Oak said, it is pretty barren. The times when I was there, it's July in Concord,
Mm.
and it is blistering hot. The ceremony.
73 degrees today, Tom.
Oh, well, that's awesome. That's awesome. The ceremony that takes place, because I think because it's kind of a hostile environment, is pretty quick in my memory, and it's a combination of a memorial service and an education lesson like we've had today.
Yeah,
But
Yeah.
believe me, if you attend next week or in the future, you're going to be much more prepared to understand what you see and hear there after listening to our speaker today.
yeah.
So thank you for that.
Yeah, there's a question. It says, Oak, you said R. Oppenheimer inspected the blast site at Port Chicago. Did the U.S. Navy suspect that this was a German atomic bomb? I think there was a consideration of whether there was a nuclear event there, and that was ruled out quickly. On the other hand, apocryphal, there are websites that exist today that say that that was a nuclear event, and it was an accident caused by the United States where they inadvertently dropped a bomb. And they say, well, why else would Oppenheimer be there? It was a coincidence, of course, but interesting stuff. There's a lot of mythology that goes on. Ed, it's a mysterious place out there.
Well, if you go through Bay Point, you get on a road called Port Chicago Highway, and it goes down toward the water, and then it swings to the right, and you keep going. Then all of a sudden, it comes to a dead end. You can't go any further on that road. You have to turn around, come back, and go up Driftwood or whatever. And I can't tell you how many times I've decided, well, today I'm going to figure it out. I go on my Google Maps and try to see what's going on over there. And Google Maps has camouflaged that somehow or another because you can't see it.
Yeah, yeah. I'll tell you, I did my own military tour of the Ardennes. I went to Bastogne and the cemetery, and I saw Patton's grave in Luxembourg, and going there is just so moving. And it seems like I heard voices.
Possible, if you listen carefully.
If you listen carefully.
Gary, you have a comment?
Yes, Oak, another question. It's probably in the book. Where did most of these African-American sailors do their basic training? Was it at Camp Stewart, Montfort Point, or Great Lakes?
Very good question. Great Lakes Naval Training Center in Chicago, and I remember it because I'm really a product of World War II, and we used to go downtown Chicago, and it was a sea of sailor hats. There were sailors that just at one point during World War II, they didn't want anybody to visit San Francisco because there were too many military in there. And the same thing with downtown Chicago. And these guys were all from Great Lakes, all of them, and they were the lowest of the low as far as testing is concerned.
Thank you.
But they were promised electricians' jobs, all kind of skilled stuff, and they got nothing.
Well, and anyone else?
I got one other thing from W. Michaels, no radioactive trace. No, that was part of it. They did not find any radioactivity in the area. But, this was July of 44. When was Hiroshima? August of 45. And Oppenheimer was right in the middle of it then. I mean, if you got the history of Oppenheimer, and I've lectured on him as well, it's really interesting how they developed that atomic bomb and how they used it.
Well, you can see the proximity of events would lead to a conspiracy theory.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Well, Oak, I want to thank you. If there's no other questions, let me take the opportunity to thank you for everyone who's here with us today and who will be viewing this recording in the future. I've already had a couple requests from people who couldn't make it today. Gee, I'm really interested. Let me know when I can watch the presentation. So I'll be sending everyone a notice of when your recording is online. It'll be on YouTube. And
Tom?
I know you're an expert on a number of subjects, and I'm hopeful you'll come back in the future and share some more of your knowledge with us.
Hey, Tom?
Glad to do it, Tom, and you're a great group. And please send me a copy of that recording because I want to share it.
Of course I will. Go ahead, Ray.
I work with the Ches Veterans Center here at the University of Illinois.
Yes.
And they have students living there, and they have a presentation. Would this be appropriate, or would it be possible to for them to see this presentation? Is that okay?
It's okay with me. I think it's great.
The recording, Ray, or are
Yeah.
you
Well,
offering Oak a speaking opportunity?
Well, I'll have to talk to them about that, but the presentation for the first thing.
Of course.
I have a meeting with the Veterans Assistance Commission tonight, and I would bring it up there. And then I work with, as I said, with the Ches Veterans Center here at the University of Illinois, and they have a class there with veterans coming in. And I just wondered if it would be okay to show the presentation, what you're recording here to them.
If it's okay with Oak, it's okay with us.
It's
Absolutely.
okay with me.
Thank you very much. It was
Thank
great. That was fantastic.
And I want to thank you all for your service. You guys are honored.
Thank you, Oak. That's kind. Well, that was just an awesome presentation. Oak, thank you again. I'm gonna sign off. Getting a few mosquitoes and I can't sit still much longer. But I'll see our regular members next Wednesday, and I'll let everyone know when Oak's recording is available. So I'm gonna stop recording now, and